Our story starts with a 22-year-old setting off on a ship. A simple journey that turns epic because his discoveries on this trip will help him come up with the theories that will throw religious beliefs into disarray and alter the way humanity looks at itself. The year was 1831. The ship was called HMS Beagle. The young man was Charles Darwin. Travel with Darwin to see how he came up with his world-changing ideas in the origin of the species and the descent of man. Join us as we see how it all fitted in place in the Darwin Puzzle. For England at the end of the 19th century, it was possibly the best of times. A huge sense of adventure and curiosity was rampant. Ships were constantly sailing from England and Europe in search of new boundaries. One such ship was the HMS Beagle. The young aristocratic Robert Fitzroy helmed the ship. Fitzroy was on the lookout for a young naturalist who would also serve as his companion. The Beagle already had a naturalist surgeon who was not of the same class as the captain. This was when John Henslow, a scholar-cum-botanist from Cambridge, came in. He recommended a young man by the name of Charles Darwin, who was then studying divinity in Cambridge. So who was Charles Darwin? Well, he was born in Shrewsbury in 1809 to a well-to-do family. From an early age, he was passionate about nature. He was sent to Edinburgh to study medicine, which he hated. He was repelled by the idea of doing surgery without anesthesia. His disappointed father sent him to Cambridge to study divinity. It was in Cambridge that he met Henslow, the cleric botanist. Darwin spent a lot of time with Henslow, who encouraged his excitement about science. And so, Darwin was recommended for a post on the Beagle. So on the 27th of December 1831, the HMS Beagle sailed from Plymouth, carrying the young Charles Darwin. To understand some of the questions that faced Darwin through his journey, one needs to have a sense of beliefs that 19th century Europe held about the origin of life and the world. The accepted social and religious theory was the idea of God having created the world in 7 days. And since God's creation needed to be perfect, the idea of a world that kept changing, the idea of beings that needed to change, were close to being blasphemous. Let us take a quick look at where the Beagle was intending to sail on this historic journey. From England, the Beagle was to sail south towards the Cape Verde Islands of Africa's western coast. It then would move to Brazil and continue down the coast of Argentina and the Falkland Islands before rounding the Cape Horn and following the Pacific coast of Latin America north before reaching the Galapagos Islands. From the Galapagos, it was planning to cross the Pacific Ocean to Sydney, Australia, before moving onwards to Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, and then Cape Town, South Africa. From Cape Town, the Beagle would then cross the Atlantic once again, touching the Brazilian coast before finally making its way back to England. As far as Darwin was concerned, the first significant stop of the Beagle was the island of St. Jago, or Santiago in the Cape Verde Islands. He made his first curious discovery here. He found a horizontal white layer of shells on the cliff face. It was perhaps the first piece of the jigsaw that would come together to reveal Darwin's dangerous ideas. How did the shells end up 45 meters above sea level? Was it possible that small upward movements of the land raised the shell layer? This went against the accepted belief of an unchanging world. The Beagle crossed the equator on 16th February. They then arrived at Brazil. Darwin described the scene as beautiful beyond his wildest dreams. Darwin read while he was on board the ship. One of the books he read was Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. This book was actually a piece of the jigsaw. He believed that the earth was constantly and continuously changing. Rain gradually wore down canyons. Mountains inched up out of the sea. Lyell called this theory uniformitarianism. His theory worked on the basis of a world that was enormously old. This idea of an old world was going to be hugely helpful when Darwin put his evolutionary theories in place. The next significant stop of the Beagle from Darwin's point of view was at Punta Alta. While the Beagle was docked there, he uncovered a huge collection of fossil bones in a cliff at Punta Alta. One exciting find was the fossil of the little-known Megatherium, which he was able to identify by its tooth and its similarity to the local armadillos. Darwin also uncovered the complete fossil of a very large animal, which he could not identify. It turned out to be a giant sloth. What struck Darwin as very odd was that some of the fossils were embedded in a cliff face below a layer of the white seashells, similar to the layer he found on the island of Santiago the year before. Here was another piece of the jigsaw. Why were there no animals that looked like this creature? Did they go extinct? And if so, when? Did change in the environment cause their extinction? If so, why? He brought all these fossils back to the ship to send to England. A month later, 30 miles up the coast from Punta Alta, Darwin discovered another fossil-rich sea cliff. This rose 120 feet above sea level and was located in a place called Monte Hermoso. There, he unearthed the stony remains of several gnawing creatures. These seemed to resemble the agouti, a capybara, and a smaller South American rodent, the tuca-tuca. The curious thing is that the match between fossils and living species was close, but not identical. Still later and further south, on the Argentine coast, he excavated a third set of mammal bones. When this was examined later by an anatomist, an image of the animal it must have been emerged. They called it a macrochenia. It looked similar to a camel, but not quite identical. As the voyage continued, these discoveries, analogies, and juxtapositions fostered in Darwin's imagination. Meanwhile, the fossils themselves were created and shipped to Henslow in England. When they arrived, they created much excitement and curiosity. In September 1832, the Beagle anchored near Bahia Blanca, a settlement at the head of a bay about 400 miles southwest of Buenos Aires. For more than a month, the Beagle remained in that area, some of its crew occupied with surveying, others assigned to shore duties, digging a well, gathering firewood, hunting for meat. One day, the local hunters brought in a large flightless bird. When Darwin ate the bird, he recorded that the red meat of the big bird resembled beef. Eating this bird would, oddly enough, form another piece of the puzzle. It would eventually play a role in his evolutionary thinking. Months later, when the Beagle was near Patagonia, Darwin spent time ashore with some of the local inhabitants. He heard them talk about a rare form of ostrich, smaller than the common one, with shorter legs and more easily killed using their bolas. Then one of Darwin's shipmates shot the bird for its meat. The bird was skinned and cooked before my memory returned. He wrote in a passage so candid you could almost see him smacking his forehead with his palm. But the head, neck, legs, wings, and many of the large feathers and a large part of the skin had been preserved. He rescued those scraps and sent them to England. The ornithologist John Gould confirmed that it was a distinct species and called it Rare Darwini. Here was still another piece of the jigsaw. Two rares with very little overlap in terms of geographical area. The greater rare inhabited the Pampas and northern Patagonia. The lesser rare replaced it beyond Rio Negro and occupied southern Patagonia. It intrigued Darwin that though the rares were similar, they overlapped very little in geographical distribution. What could explain this? The Beagle's voyage continued down the coast of South America. The ship eventually rounded Cape Horn. As the journey progressed, more questions, more pieces of the puzzle kept popping up. Darwin kept noticing how species in South America were similar to those in Europe. This conflicted with the notion that God created each species perfectly adapted to its particular environment. The geology of many of the places fascinated him too. Many of the valleys he traveled through had the layers of shells he had first seen in St. Jago. Darwin was slowly reaching the conclusion that many of these cliffs, and indeed the Andes Mountains themselves, had been slowly rising above sea level. The evidence for a planet in a state of constant flux was becoming stronger and stronger. The most significant chapter of this journey commenced in September 1835 as the ship reached the Galapagos Islands. On the islands, Darwin found huge turtles, tortoise, and lizards. Since the islands were uninhabited, the animals were not afraid of people, and so Darwin was able to study them very closely. Observing these animals gave rise to a lot more pieces of the puzzle. The species he saw here were unlike any other he had seen. Even more interesting was the fact that the animals varied from island to island. For example, a tortoise on one of the islands was not quite like a tortoise from another island. Larger tortoises with domed shells inhabit islands with humid highlands, while smaller tortoises with saddleback shells and longer necks inhabit islands with dry lowlands. The finches on the islands were even more interesting. All the finches had dull feathers and short tails. They all laid pink and white eggs in nests with small roofs. But they all had different beaks. On one island, they had strong, thick beaks for cracking open nuts and seeds. On another island, 80 kilometers away, they had long, thin beaks for catching insects. This led to a whole new train of thought. In his Journal of Researches, Darwin speculates, seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. Having completed its task, it was time for the Beagle to head home. The 2-year journey had stretched to 5. After almost circumnavigating the world, the Beagle reached England in October 1836. The 27-year-old Darwin came home changed in many ways. He did not have all the answers yet, but he clearly knew what the big questions were. Could one species turn into another? Why did the living animals in the region resemble the fossils of the same region? Was it possible that one had changed into another through time? How do species originate? Darwin was already a celebrity of sorts. He had earned a reputation as a zoologist based on the unusual specimens that he had shipped back through his journey. He also came to be known as a geologist who supported the theories of Charles Lyell. Though his mind was full of bigger questions, he didn't start work on any of the theories fermenting in his head. Instead, he worked on collating his notes and impressions of his trip and published his journal. This was a runaway success and catapulted him into fame. All the while, he worked on his theories in private, married his cousin Emma Wedgwood, started to raise a family, and continued his research. Through these years, various pieces of his jigsaw started coming together. He had sent many of his specimens to John Gould at the London Zoological Society. He had initially thought that the birds that he had collected in the Galapagos were a combination of finches, wrens and blackbirds, which are all different species. He learnt from Gould that this was not the case. They were not different species. They were, in fact, varieties of the same species. All the birds were finches with variations. The converse happened with the mockingbirds that he had given to Gould. Darwin had thought that these were different varieties of the same species. Gould told him that they were in fact all distinct species, each inhabiting its own island. Gould's information gave rise to a radical idea. Could varieties of birds isolated on separate islands somehow turn into new species? Which meant that species were not designed to be constant and perfect. There could be transmutation of one species into another. By 1837, Darwin had drawn his first evolutionary tree. He sketched a tree where each branch was a species, joined in kinship with other species. In this model, it seemed absurd to talk of one animal being higher than another. He wrote, "I think," above it. He had written in his notebook that it was possible that one species does change into another. To explain the geographical distribution of living species such as the rays, finches, tortoise and extinct ones such as the strange macrauchenia. But where would humans fit into this puzzle? Another piece of the puzzle fell into place with a visit to the London Zoo in 1838. He saw the antics and interactions of Jenny, an orangutan. Its human-like behavior had a profound influence on him. He wrote afterwards that man in his arrogance thinks himself a great work, worthy the interposition of a deity, more humble and I believe true to consider him created from animals. He kept this thought a secret for a while. He didn't feel ready to share it with an orthodox world. Maybe he had an inkling that this was an idea that would change the world. A crucial piece of the puzzle fell into place when Darwin casually picked up an essay on population by Thomas Malthus. In his essay, Malthus suggested that population growth would always overpower food supply growth, creating perpetual states of hunger, disease and struggle. With a sudden clarity, Darwin realized that this natural, ever-present struggle for survival could be extended to the evolutionary scheme. It was a eureka moment. Take the finches of the Galapagos, for instance. Darwin believed that the birds had originally flown from South America and landed on the Galapagos Islands. Some finches landed on one island and some on others. They ate the food available on the island. Some islands were rich in seeds, which the finches ate. Other islands had many insects, so the finches ate them. Take an island with insects. One of the birds there would have a longer, thinner beak, which was more suited for eating insects. This bird would have a better chance of survival over generations. Since this finch had a competitive edge over other finches, it would reproduce more and pass on the more specialized beaks to successive generations. With the passage of time, thousands of years, the finches on the island with insects had long, thin beaks. The ones on the island with seeds had short, strong beaks that helped them crack the seeds. And the ones on an island with buds and fruit had claw-like beaks to help them grind the food. This tied in with Malthus's idea of a struggle. Darwin theorized that some competitors would be better equipped to survive. Those that were less able would die out, leaving only those with the more desirable traits. This struggle between those more and less fit to survive would produce a never-ending progression of changes in the organism. In its simplest form, this is evolution through natural selection. Darwin went a step further. The two rays he had seen in South America were similar but not identical. They seemed to succeed each other, not vertically, but across the horizontal dimension of landscape. The sloths and armadillos seem to have come from earlier such forms. The comparison between extinct animals and similar living ones added to this idea. And Darwin had before him the idea of evolution, the idea of relatedness and succession among species. So this was what evolution was. The pieces of the jigsaw finally came together. However, for the next 20 years, Darwin didn't publish either the idea of natural selection or his theory of evolution. A factor that may have held him back from publishing his ideas immediately was the widespread religious orthodoxy in England during the 1830s and 1840s. He could have been charged with sedition and blasphemy for widely publishing his revolutionary theory. One can see Darwin's dilemma clearly in his diaries. In 1838 he wrote, "I had got a theory, but I was so anxious to avoid prejudice that I determined not for some time to write even the briefest sketch of it." And so Darwin worked on barnacles for almost a decade, scared to publish his theory. In 1858, he was still in the middle of writing a long, detailed, heavily footnoted treatise on natural selection. He heard from a younger man called Alfred Russel Wallace. Uncannily, Wallace had come up with an almost same theory as Darwin. It appeared in November 1859, titled "On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection." It was a sellout success immediately. Darwin carefully didn't extend his ideas to man. He even avoided the then controversial term evolution. But the logical extension of Darwin's theory was that Homo sapiens was simply another form of animal. He ended the book on an almost placatory note, saying, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms, or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on, according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved." Nonetheless, Darwin was vehemently attacked, particularly by the church. One of Darwin's biggest supporters was Thomas Henry Huxley, who came to be known as Darwin's bulldog. In 1860, there was a famous debate between Huxley and Archbishop Samuel Wilberforce at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. The bishop started off the debate by asking Huxley in jest as to whether his relationship to apes was through his father's or mother's side. One version has it that Huxley muttered, "The Lord hath delivered him into my hands," and proceeded to give a brilliant defense of Darwin's theory. He concluded his debate saying that he would rather claim the ancestry of an ape than be a man afraid to face the truth. However, soon Darwin's ideas gained acceptance. 5 more editions of The Origin of Species went to print during Darwin's lifetime. Almost inarguably, it's the most significant single scientific book ever published. Today, modern science has confirmed the truth of Darwin's ideas. All life is indeed related. Fossils have been found of intermediate forms that confirm the entire idea of evolution. Despite repeated bouts of illness, Darwin managed to complete his big book, which was published in 1873. Titled "The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex," it handled the idea of human evolution and, in a sense, completed the work he had begun in The Origin of Species. The second was the idea that competition for mates between individuals of the same sex drives the evolution of certain traits. Darwin felt this could explain why the males and females of many species were so different. why often males had such distinctive and often improbable features like the peacock's tail, the turkey's wattles, or the stag's antlers. So how did this work? Take the peacock, for example. It was clear to Darwin that the dramatic plumage didn't help the bird fly. It in fact is so unwieldy that it could reduce chances of survival. What was its use then? He proposed that the feathers were useful because they attracted females. Why? Well, it isn't only the fact that the peacock with more feathers is more eye-catching. The fact that the male could survive with the feathers proved that he was a healthy, vigorous male, good father material. Experiments have been done that prove the truth of this theory. When confronted with peacocks with varying plumage, the peahen will almost always pick the peacock with the longest feather length. The reception of the ideas in dissent was more moderate. The scientific community had accepted his ideas and they were slowly being absorbed by society. But nothing could match Darwin's brilliant thinking about the evolutionary process. No one could match what Darwin would have to say about the subject of man. Darwin knew that evolution was one of the most important ideas for the human species to comprehend. It is almost integral to humanity to search for roots, to look for one's origins. And evolution, in a sense, provided some answers to these eternal questions. Darwin died on April 19, 1882, after coping with many years of illness. He was given a state funeral and buried at Westminster Abbey. Today, with the tools of modern genetics, we know that Darwin's ideas are true. His legacy is everywhere, from stamps to animals named after him, to awards. There is no doubt that he is one of the most important scientists of all time. He changed the way we look at God. He changed the way we look at humankind. He changed the way we look at the world.